Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Spiritual Enrichment Sunday morning session today. Today is part 2 of trauma. We're doing this series on trauma because it's a unique lens to understand how human beings are both wounded in life and also with the promise of healing. And Trynia will take us into that today from the perspective of teaching. This relates to our spiritual life because Jesus was a healer. There's a lot of ways of understanding Jesus, but to understand Jesus as a healer is one of the best ways to understand Jesus. Jesus was always interested in getting to the root issue of why someone is alienated from their best health, from society, and from their relationship with the divine. And trauma provides this, for me, a brand new lens, way of seeing not only what is, but how a person can heal from life's traumas. I'd like to begin our session today with a brief meditation, as we usually do. How many of you ever have a chance to listen to On Being on Sunday morning or any other time on WBEZ Public Radio? Krista Tippett is the host on at 7 o'clock, which is my driving time, so I get to listen to her. And her guest this morning, and I don't have the name, maybe some of you listen to it and you know her, the guest's name. She was talking about gathering, the significance of gathering, which is something we forget about how significant it is when people come together, whether it's in person or on Zoom. And she's built her whole career on gathering. And she says the important thing is not what you do, but why you do it and the preparation that goes into it. She defines a gathering as 3 or more people who come together for a common purpose for an event that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So this is a gathering. But the question that the guest today on Being suggested is most important is, why are you doing it? And she says you should ask that question whether it's a first grader's 6th birthday party. And she said, especially if it's a 6-year-old's birthday party, or if it's a gathering in a religious setting like ours, or just a barbecue. You need to ask, why are we doing it? Asking why you do it gives more meaning to the event. So I thought for our devotion today, I would read, and in a way that allows us to absorb the meaning of the purpose of this gathering, spiritual enrichment on Sunday morning. We have a statement of who we are, our mission statement, and then our values. So I'm just going to read, we're not going to discuss it. I just ask you to absorb this, especially considering the people who are here today, both on Zoom and in the Centennial Room. Take a deep breath in and out, and be relaxed in your body. Another breath in and out. Spiritual Enrichment is Winnetka Congregational Church's ministry of faith exploration and formation, uniting head and heart in pursuit of an honest and vibrant Christian faith that is open, relevant, faithful, and transformative. Our mission statement: enriching minds, expanding faith, transforming hearts. Our values: we believe that the spiritual journey is a lifelong process. Throughout our years, we continue to explore deep questions, examine ethical challenges, and grow in wisdom, compassion, faith, and connection with others. We grow by drawing on our Christian heritage, the wisdom of the ages, the inner spark of our own spirit, and being recognized and heard in thoughtful conversation with others. Independent thinking, welcome. Trynia Kaufman is an education writer and consultant. She's a former high school special education teacher and has a master's degree in neuroscience and education. And Trynia joins us today from Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Trynia. Over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and really just inspired that you all are spending this time to talk about trauma and to think about it and think about how we can be more, have more grace for ourselves during this really challenging time and also for others. Technically, officially, I am talking about trauma-informed teaching. However, if I have any teachers in the room, you know that teaching really is about building relationships. And so everything we're talking about today comes back to the relationships we have with other people, and especially with kids, and how we can support them. And I also like to center us on the fact that even if you're not in an official teaching role, as an adult in the community, as an adult in a church, you are a teacher. Kids are always looking to adults to think about how they can be in the world, how they can thrive, and how to deal with challenging situations. So we are all teachers in one context or another. I am not a psychologist, so we are talking about trauma, but I am talking about it through the lens of education, through the lens of relationships, and hopefully the strategies that we talk about today will be useful, but also keep in mind that and I watched the session that you all had last week, and I'm so glad that you started out with that foundational conversation about trauma from a psychologist, to think about the spectrum of how trauma affects us as individuals, and that when it does rise to a level of needing more support, that we seek out that professional support that we might need from a therapist or a psychologist. And I wanted to start with this quote from trauma researcher Peter Levine. So Peter says, "The paradox of trauma is that it has both the power to destroy and the power to transform and resurrect." And so we don't want to minimize the impact, the negative impact that trauma has on our lives and on other people's lives, but we also don't want to drown in that trauma, right? And we can, I'm sure all of us can think of instances over these past couple of years with the pandemic of how this challenging experience has been used for good in some ways, and that we have found ways to build a better society in some ways. And so an example that I think of from the education world is that for a lot of time, for all of time, since we had the internet, there have been communities of people who did not have access to the internet. And this has been a really big challenge in the education space as we've moved into a more tech-savvy world where we're expecting kids to do research, to do their homework on the internet, to submit assignments, to be able to access assignments through the internet. And because of lots of schools moving to a distance learning environment, to doing things online, we realized, or we really put a highlight on the fact that some families don't have access to the internet. And so a lot of schools and states put a focus on making sure people had access, that they had devices they could use, and that they had internet that they could use at home. And so that's just an example of how we can take a really horrible situation and find a way that we can use that to improve society going forward. So what we're going to talk about today, and I, as a teacher, I love to have a visual, so that is why I have these slides. It's also to help me stay on track, but I'm also going to send these slides afterwards so that you all can refer back to them if that's helpful, and that you have this visual as we go through. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts that we've seen from the pandemic, specifically on schools and on children. We're going to talk a little bit about how does trauma affect us. I know you started having this conversation last week, so we won't spend too much time there. I want to spend most of our time thinking about how can we help others, especially kids, and how can we also help ourselves cope with trauma. So during the pandemic, this is not going to be news to any of you. We have seen increases, obviously, in illness, in deaths of loved ones. It's always important to recognize that this has impacted some communities more than others. We know that communities of color and low-income communities experienced this more than other communities did, and still are. We've also seen upticks in unemployment, financial instability, hunger, domestic violence, community shootings and homicides, protests over police shootings and racial injustice. And this is not to say that this was not happening before, but we had this opportunity to shine a light on something that has been going on and really bring that to the forefront and have that difficult conversation. And so similarly, we've seen an exacerbation of societal inequities in the schooling system. We've seen inequities in the resources that schools had available to them. And of course, this comes back to the segregation that we have in our school districts in terms of income and also in terms of race and the resources that are available to them. So the CDC also reported a significant uptick in emergency room visits for mental health emergencies. And this was during the pandemic in the latter half of 2020. So for children ages 5 to 11 years old, we saw a 24% increase in ER visits for mental health. And for our adolescents, we saw a 31% increase. So we know that mental health needs have definitely been on the rise, and especially for our young adults. As we've headed back to school this year, many schools are reporting more behavior issues. And of course, this is not all schools. A lot of kids are excited and happy to go back to school, but some kids are having a hard time making that transition. They might have been out of the school environment for the past 18 months or had significant disruptions in their education. And this can make it hard to adjust and go back. And they might also be dealing with things at home that are hard for them to deal with. We're all going through a pandemic. That's hard to deal with. And so that can have an effect on how we interact with other people. And we'll talk more about that. So Denver Public Schools reported a 21% increase in fighting. Teachers and families are seeing social skills delays in kids. And if we think about how many of us have been stuck at home, and for kids who are just learning these social skills, to have been out of that environment and not been around their peers and their friends, they might be a little bit delayed in knowing how to interact with other people. They might not know how to act in a classroom or how to act in a church environment. And so it's having a little more grace for kids and helping them to learn these things that they might have missed out on. So how does trauma impact us? Okay, so I wanted to start with this picture. We have all had the experience of having a small cut on our finger, and we just don't understand why it hurts so much, and it's so distracting. And so what is happening in our body is that our body is making that skin around the cut more sensitive. And so it's more sensitive than it would be in a normal situation because your body is trying to protect that area. It knows that it's already injured. And so it becomes hypersensitive so that you baby that finger and you protect it and make sure that you don't hit it again or cut it on another piece of paper, that it doesn't get infected and that you don't make it worse. And so the same thing is happening in your brain if you're experiencing a mental trauma, and that your brain is trying to protect you. So it might make you overly sensitive. You might be jumpy or defensive. You might be distracted. And the important thing to remember is that this is completely normal. It's a necessary reaction in the brain and the body. It's what helps keep us safe. And so we can think of this cute little bunny who has heard something and is perking up to see what's in its environment, to see if it's safe. And so that bunny is not going to focus on other things. It's not going to go learn its ABCs or math. It needs to make sure that it is safe in its environment before it can go back to what it was doing before. And so this is a normal reaction. Trauma is not, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It is our response to what is happening in the environment. So it becomes problematic when we get stuck in this high alert and vigilant state. And considering the pandemic, which has been going on, for 18 months or so now, this is a long time to be stuck in this high vigilant state. And so this is when we need to be really thoughtful about how we're taking care of ourselves, how we're taking care of each other. And so I have this image of the roundabout. If you've driven on a roundabout, you know that the goal is not just to drive around and around in a circle, right? We have to find the exit point to head in the direction that we want to go. And so we don't want to get stuck driving around in a circle. So these are some signs of possible trauma. The first thing I want to point out is that these symptoms or behaviors can be caused by lots of different things. So we can't make assumptions about what it is. It could be anxiety, it could be ADHD, it could be a physical illness, or we might just be having a bad day. But it is good to be aware of some of these symptoms so we can think about them within ourselves and when we see these behaviors from other people, and especially our children. So we might become irritable, quick to anger. We might be jumpy, we might withdraw or be sad. Trauma can also cause physical pain. So we might feel it in our stomach, we might feel it in our head. It can cause us to be distracted. So I've been in Brooklyn and New York during the whole pandemic. And so the very first spring, when it was really horrible here in New York, I found that I was incredibly distracted. I could not focus on things like I used to be able to focus on things, even reading, which is something I do for fun. I couldn't read even just like a casual book for fun. My brain was hyper focused on, the only thing I could focus on was something that was COVID related. And so learning as much as I could about what was going on, and how I could protect myself. And so we can find ourselves being very distracted, and it's hard for us to focus in the way that we typically are able to. We might be disorganized. For kids, they might be avoiding school, they might be absent from school. We might have trouble socializing because our brain is so hyper focused on what's traumatizing us. And so many of you, especially if your teachers, have seen this quote before. The children who need love the most will always ask for it in the most unloving ways. And so if we think back on all of these signs of possible trauma, when we see this in another person, if someone is being grumpy with us, if they are disorganized and they're not listening to us, this can be a really frustrating experience. And especially if we're trying to teach them something, it can be very, very challenging. Okay, so it's important to remind ourselves that something is causing these behaviors. And generally, if someone is acting in this way, they are feeling stressed out or out of control themselves, and we need to help them figure out how to regulate their bodies and how to return to that baseline. So we want to build relationships, not assumptions. We don't know what's going on for different people. Everyone reacts differently to what they're going through. Even the same events will affect people in different ways. And so the only way we can find that out is by talking with them, by having a relationship with them, and not assuming we know what's going on. Okay, so let's dive into what can we do? How can we help? So like I said at the beginning, first of all, know when to get professional help. If there is an emergency, of course, call 911. If psychological distress is severe or ongoing, get professional help. Even if we have training as a counselor, we probably should not be the counselor for our loved ones, for our family and our friends. So we need to seek outside help. So if anyone is talking about suicide or hurting other people, if they are self-harming, if they're cutting themselves or having panic attacks, get professional help in that situation. And especially for our teens and our adolescents, and even our preteens, making sure that they know that there's people they can call if they don't feel comfortable talking to their family or other adults in their life. Having an anonymous place they can call, it's really important that they know they can do that. Okay, with that aside, so what can we do individually? And so I want to take just 30 seconds. I'm going to give us 30 seconds to think through this. So these behaviors and these signs of potential trauma, I want you to think through, which have you noticed in others or in yourself? And which do you have the hardest time dealing with? So look through this. Which ones of these rub you really wrong or really are frustrating to you when you see that in another person or when you see it in yourself? And I'll just give you a little bit to think about that quietly. Feel free to jot down notes or just think to yourself. Okay, so a lot of times when we're seeing these difficult behaviors and signs in other people, we like to try to control the situation, especially when we're dealing with children. We feel like we should be the ones in control. And sometimes that can cause us to get really tough on them. And we might implement consequences or discipline, punishments, when really, oftentimes, especially if a child is going through something traumatic, if they are really stressed out, they don't need us to control the situation. They actually need some more control given to them. And so we're going to talk through some strategies that I've created this nifty little acronym for MELTS to help us remember some of the strategies. So we will talk through each of these individually. Number one is mind your own mind. So this is looking at yourself first and how you can really practice self-care for yourself. Number two is expect emotions, empathize, empower choices. Number three is looking for the root. So what is causing this behavior or these symptoms? Four is teaching strategies. And then five is safety and support. So first, mind your own mind. So this starts with self-awareness. So just like when you are on an airplane, you have to put your own mask on first. Think about yourself, how you're reacting to what's going on in your life. Are you feeling overly or chronically stressed? Did you identify with some of those signs of trauma? And how do you typically react when kids or adults in your life don't do what you want them to do? And then secondly, it comes to self-management. So how are you taking care of yourself? Are you taking care of your physical needs? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating healthy foods, exercising, drinking water? Do you have enough love in your life, enough laughter? And being a positive model for how to cope with emotions. And this doesn't mean that we're not expressing our emotions or that we're hiding them from other people, especially for kids in our life. They need to see that we all have a variety of emotions, and that is okay. That's the human experience. Sometimes those emotions are really positive and we feel good about that. And sometimes those emotions are more difficult. And so by showing kids in our life how we cope with those difficult feelings, what strategies we have, and we're going to talk through some of those strategies as we go through. So we're going to do another pause and reflect. I'm going to come back to mind your own mind. And I want you to take 30 seconds to think through some of these questions, and feel free to jot down some thoughts to yourself. And at the end, we can share some reflections. So I will give you just a little bit more quiet time to think through some of these. Okay, so our second one is to expect emotions, empathize, and empower choices. And so especially right now, we know that people are going through challenging times, and we can expect that there will be a variety of emotions, and they might be big and they might be intense, but by changing our expectations, we can at least be prepared for that. And I like to use this analogy of a snowy, icy road. It's not winter yet, but we know it's coming. And hopefully we have learned some strategies. I'm so thankful in New York, I don't have to drive in the snow anymore. I ride the subway. But it's important for us to know, if we are driving, how to drive on a snowy or icy road. And the same thing goes for interacting with people who are going through a challenging time. We have to have strategies. We have to know how to support them through that challenging time and to support ourselves. So first and foremost, we can plan for it. We know it snowed, so we can be ready. We can think about it. We can slow down. And this goes for when we're teaching kids or our expectations of kids. We can slow down and thinking about what's happened over these past 18 months. Kids are going to need to reacclimate to school, to social situations. They might have to learn things that they missed over the past 18 months. And so that might be slowing. We need to slow down a little bit in what we're thinking, what we think kids should be able to do at this age or at this grade level. And it doesn't mean reducing our expectations. We still want to let kids know, like, hey, we want you to do great things. We know you can learn this, but we might need to slow down and give them some time to adjust. And we need to take our foot off the gas. If we start sliding on the ice, we do not want to add fuel to that fire. And so if a child or another person is starting to act in a way that is, they're having a stressful reaction. So they might be defensive, they might be angry. When we're seeing that in someone else, we don't want to bring that same level of intensity back at them. So you know that if your partner or if your loved one is mad and is starting to get frustrated with you, if you get frustrated right back at them, you're not going to get anywhere, right? And so sometimes we need to back off, take our foot off the gas, and give people time to process these big emotions and to return to their baseline before we can come back and have a conversation. And so we're shifting into neutral. We're not coming back with our own big feelings. We're going to remain calm, remain objective, allow people time to work through these feelings. And we're going to avoid slamming on the brakes. So we can't expect someone who is very escalated, who's very upset, to immediately go from 100 to 0. It is going to take time. It might be taking a 5-minute break. going and doing something fun in the other room or listening to music, and then coming back to have a conversation. And we don't want to oversteer in the situation. So especially, like I said, as adults, we like to control the situation for it to look like we're in control. But kids who are having a trauma response, they need to have the power. They need to have control in their lives because they're feeling out of control already. So if you are trying to oversteer and control that environment, you are heightening this loss of control in the other person. And so we can guide them, we can help them get to where they need to go, but we don't want to oversteer. And so what this could look like is we're empowering choices. So if we're interacting with a kid, it might be giving them the choice of, do you want me to leave you alone for a few minutes? Or do you want to talk about this? Do you want to go outside and go for a walk, or do you want to draw? You know, giving choices based on what we know they like to do, what might be soothing or calming to them, and giving them those options. And then we want to look for the roots. So this is looking for the cause of the behavior. And this might not be in the moment. If we're in a really heated moment where people are upset, that might not be the time to look for the roots. It might be later when we've calmed down, when we've returned to our baseline, and asking ourselves, what could be triggering this? Did I say something that triggered this behavior? Could I do something different that would help this other person move through their emotions rather than triggering them? And by understanding where behavior is coming from, we can cultivate more empathy in ourselves. So we can understand where they're coming from, why this is happening, and that can help us to not get as upset by a behavior that maybe is frustrating to us. And it can also help us identify strategies that maybe can help that person. So let's talk about some of the strategies. And so these can be useful for ourselves and for kids in our lives. So building skills, and this happens outside of those heated moments. We are not building skills when someone is escalated, when they're upset. We are doing this in a time that is calm, when everyone is at their baseline. And so we start with learning how to recognize and identify emotions. This can be easier for some kids, it's harder for other kids. And it might be thinking about, like, what are the physical sensations that are attached to an emotion? So for me, I know that I'm prone to anxiety. And I feel that in my body by I have sweaty palms. Sometimes I might get nauseous. And these are physical symptoms of the anxiety. And so sometimes with kids, they might feel these physical symptoms, but not know what it's coming from. And we have to help them make that connection of, oh, this is what's causing me to feel this way. And then that allows them to understand the emotion and then to do something about it. So we can talk about how our emotions influence our actions and behaviors. We can help kids build social skills and connections. This is super important right now. We all, as humans, we need this sense of belonging, that people have accepted us, that we have a group of people that we like to be around. And so it's really important that we make sure our kids have those spaces, that they know how to make friends, and that we help them do that. We already talked about focusing on things we can control. We can help kids identify things they can control. So rather than focusing on things like the pandemic, which we don't have control over, what are the things in my life that I can control? Where can I have a positive impact? And we have to be our own coach and friend. So it's great. We need social support, but sometimes we have to be able to do that for ourselves. And so you might have heard this talked about as like positive self-talk. So when we hear that negative voice in our head, it's reframing that, talking back to that negative voice, and coaching ourselves through it. And so we can help our kids learn to do this as well. And I should say, all of this can be done in an informal context. This can be done just by having conversations with kids. A lot of schools are using, you might have heard of social-emotional learning programs that a lot of schools are adopting, which is great, and it goes through a lot of these things. But I don't want you to feel like you have to have a program. We're all human, we've all had emotions, and we can help our kids learn how to identify those and how to work with their emotions. And then we can help them find an outlet. And this goes for ourselves as well. There are lots of different outlets. We might prefer different ones at different times. We might want a social outlet. We might want to talk about what's going on, but we also might not want to, and that's okay. So some people prefer a physical outlet. So going for a run, punching a punching bag. A creative outlet, so drawing or creating something. Environmental outlet, this is it can be two things. So it can be walking away from an environment where you don't feel comfortable or where you're feeling really upset or escalated. It might mean leaving that environment for a little while till you calm down and you can return to your baseline. But it can also be, especially as so many of us have been stuck at home over the past year and a half, it can be depressing to be stuck in one spot all the time. And so sometimes we have to be conscious about, well, I need to get out of this environment and go somewhere else for a little bit to stimulate my brain and to get some endorphins going. Maybe I need to go outside or go in the yard or go for a walk, or even just go into a different room for a little bit. Mindful outlets. I love that we kicked this off with some mindfulness. That's a really great strategy to use to calm ourselves and to return ourselves to a baseline. Okay, safety and support. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, think about how you can be a safe space, a supportive person. And this does not mean you have to have a really close relationship with every child you interact with or every person you interact with. Even just being a safe person, someone who is not making the situation worse. So let's not escalate trauma. Let's be a safe space. And so we know from research that kids that have one positive relationship with an adult, it's one of the most important things that we can do for kids is to make sure they have a positive relationship with an adult in their life. And so think about how you can be that safety, that support for other people, how you can increase this feeling of belonging for kids in their environment with their peers, and just create more safety, especially during this really challenging couple of years we've had. So this is just a review of what we went through. So mind your own mind, expect emotions, look for the root, teach strategies, and provide safety and support. And so I will leave you with, and then we'll go into a reflection and any questions that have come up. But here's a quote from Sally: "Great opportunities to help others seldom come, but small ones surround us every day." So we have lots of opportunities to make a really big impact in people's lives just by our everyday interactions with them. So I'll be sending this out to everyone. So here's references, some links for everyone. And then we'll move into reflections and questions. So I'm going to stop screen share. And I would love to hear anyone's reflections that you had along the way, any wonderings you had, questions that have come up. I don't know the answer to everything, but we can all support each other and try to come up with some ideas.
Trynia, this is such an excellent presentation. Your ideas are so clear and common sense and actionable. Yeah, This is wonderful. I'd like to remind folks that Trynia has an article on the internet, and I put a link to it in the messenger and also the spiritual enrichment update. It's called What You Need to Know About Trauma-Informed Teaching. If you are on Zoom and you would like to speak up, remember to unmute yourself.
Well, when you came up with that last quotation about great opportunities seldom come our way, but little opportunities surround us every day. Everybody now in this room said, And I think even this morning already with my son, we already had sort of a situation. And I think what we really seek to find in a religious organization, as this is that support, that constant support of others, unwavering. And I think that is so important. Like that's one of the most important things to remember. And when, as you said, when others are out of sorts, it really they are hurting, and they need others to support them and give more. I thought your speech was wonderful, and also your stock photo or your does not do you justice. So I think you should get a new.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing.
I have had a constant problem all of my life from childhood on with insomnia. No matter what the day has been involved, joyful or complicated, every evening I face the fact, will I be able to sleep? And we all know what it's like to get up in the morning having had a bad night's of sleep. And at least once a week, I've had a night with no sleep at all and function anyway. It ain't fun, McGee, as they say, but I have learned that making a list in the morning of things to do and being able to check off that little list, or in other words, the physical activity of organizing my day and making a list of what needs to be done, and then perhaps thinking, oh, that was tomorrow, maybe I can do it today. That's a perk up. But keeping in control, whether I'm feeling rested or not, helps me a lot.
Very good point. It occurred to me that most of us participating here are, shall we say, older, and it occurs to me that here we are at this age, trying to learn how to deal with anxiety and trauma and what have you. It would have been so helpful to be educated, if you will, earlier on in our lives. And I wonder, can you speak, and maybe the teachers who have taught here can speak about our children being educated about how to handle trauma and emotion in the grade schools and high schools and what have you, or are they still just learning as the years go by?
I think that's a great question. And I would, if there are teachers in the room, I would love for you to, oh, I see Betty. Yep.
Yeah. I went to school in Winnetka and taught elementary art there for 20 some years. And I think about some of the things that I did, because each class would come as a group, but they were all individuals that had different needs. And to keep them happy with what they were doing based on their skills. And then the fact that every classroom had a different class personality. I know if one would come in and I knew from experience that they were fidgety and needed movement, and yet they had to kind of stay in their seats, I would put different supplies that they were going to need in different parts of the room. So they had to get up and go over and get it and come back again. Mm-hmm. And then they were able to sit for a while longer. And even when our son was little, I remember giving him choices rather than telling him what to do. If it was breakfast, instead of saying we're having cereal, I would say, would you like Wheaties or Cheerios? And then he had a choice. And I think the most important thing that I learned as a child in school was how to problem solve. And that's kind of lasted me forever. And so I would always try to do that with the children too. If they were working in clay and needed a mast for their ship or whatever, and it kept falling down and bending, and I'd say, you know, what would be stronger? And I said, well, maybe I could make it out of a piece of wood. I mean, it was just kind of a natural thing, I guess, but I certainly enjoyed all of my teaching, that's for sure.
Yeah, from what I've seen in different school districts, there's definitely been a greater focus on social and emotional learning, understanding, you know, our own emotions and how to deal with them. And especially from the pandemic, I would say that's one of the silver linings, is that a lot of schools are putting more focus on this because they know kids can't learn if they're not regulated, if they're not feeling safe and supported. And so we know that we have to take care of that social emotional aspect while we're trying to educate kids. And of course, as you were saying, that's so important just in our lives of knowing how to manage our emotions and deal with difficult things. And I think there's just been so much research over the past couple of decades, understanding what's going on in the brain and the body and how this anxiety and trauma impacts us. And so a lot of that is getting passed along to teachers and to adults in general. And so I think that carries on in our interactions with our kids and our grandkids and kids in our community. They're seeing us pick up this knowledge and use it in our own lives. And that will help them be able to use that in their lives as well. So formally and informally, we're moving in that direction, but certainly more we could do.
Seems to me, Trynia, that your comments today aren't just about teaching, they're also about parenting. Of course, in a sense, our first teachers are our parents, right? Or grandparents.
Absolutely.
But I'm going to try to make sure that our parents at our church get a chance to listen to and this session. I think it'd be helpful as parents.
That's a great idea.
I'm going to thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Trynia. I'm a parent, I'm not a teacher, but I've got third graders, and you reminded me about something. In first and second grade, our school has a separate class called SEL, and they know very consciously what social and emotional learning is. They're there just like they're in other classes to read, you know, learning, they're reading, they're writing, their math. In SEL, they're there to learn how to treat other people and to recognize how they're making other people feel. And they need to, then know that people are understanding how they feel. And I hope it's a backdrop for every other substantive class they take, because it should be, how you learn reading, writing, arithmetic, at least, K through 12. So thank you I'm going to be more aware of listening to my kids and spread the word to all the other parents in here in church.
And that social emotional learning isn't just about helping kids know how others are feeling. It starts with self, right? Trynia made that point.
Yeah, absolutely. But then building that empathy piece, like that's so huge. And I'm so glad to hear that the schools or at least your child's school is doing that, of helping kids recognize it in themselves, but then also like, how are my actions impacting other people, and building that empathy. I think our schools have a lot of room to grow in that area, and we can hopefully move away from some of the bullying that we've seen and ostracizing, and really make schools a more inclusive environment where kids feel safe and supported and like they belong.
Absolutely. That's a big worry for all parents, I understand. Because bullying now, if all of our kids are going to expect to have cell phones and be on the internet and wasting time with social media, what that does to allow people to bully other kids can be really scary. So maybe this is the most important time ever.
But all these things that you presented are also very applicable to all of us.
Yeah,
in our
right.
interrelationships with
Yeah.
other people.
Well stated. Yeah,
So they're in our lives, really.
Yeah. Yes.
Speaking of the bullying, have you had a problem which we ran into in Martinsburg a couple of years ago? Because you may have remembered there was sort of an outbreak of bullying at Glenbrook North. So some years ago. And it turns out that you go to the parents, and the parents were really the instigators of the bullying, but they were bullying themselves. There was that type of thing. And if they learned it at home, you know, what recourse does the teacher have? And I think it's important that when a teacher in any school, grade or high, is training the child that is acting in a very uncivil way, the root of the problem may well be at home, and the parent is the last person you want to go to for cure, because they're the problem, as was the case in one of these situations.
Yeah, it can be definitely really tricky. And I also, I want to point out like what a difficult spot all of our teachers are in, especially this year, and how much we're expecting of them to be able to be everything for all of these kids. And so if you know a teacher in your life, give them a shout out and a little bit of support too. It's definitely been a challenging couple years.
Mm-hmm. Our time is winding down. Paul, you had a hand
I
up?
was just wondering, we were talking about, Greg mentioned this wonderful SEL class that his kids are experiencing. It made me think that, well, we're here in kind of an exclusive community where we have the resources to provide this kind of training to our children. Has anyone got a sense of how more minority communities or majority schools are, where they are on this spectrum in terms of handling or teaching children how to deal with these things? Have you seen anything in that regard, Trynia?
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of focus in low-income communities, in minority heavy schools, and there is funding as well that's supporting these types of initiatives. I think the really challenging part is that we have segregated our schools in this type of way, and that children in a low-income community and children who are Black and brown have more trauma in their lives already. And so they're coming into this school environment with all of this baggage, with all of this trauma. And so even if we're implementing these social emotional learning programs, like that's great, they can learn how to identify these emotions, try to deal with them, but it's not going to fix the situation, if you know what I mean. They still have all of this trauma that they're trying to deal with, and that's not going away. And so I don't want to give the impression that social emotional learning is like the Band-Aid that we need right now. It can help, but there's a lot of other things that we need to think of when it comes to how we're building our society, our communities, our schools, to best be supportive of kids in all different communities.
We're learning at our church, and I think throughout society, about the structural and systemic issues that need as much attention as the one-on-one or small group local items. We're getting there. We've learned a lot during the pandemic about this. It taught us that we are responsible for each other, that kindness is contagious, just like coronavirus is contagious. We're in it together, and we're responsible for making a better world where there might be less trauma to start with, so we don't have to deal with it at the other end. We are at time, and I want to thank you again, Trynia, for your thoughtful presentation and how it fostered this very thoughtful conversation.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you all for being here. Spiritual enrichment happens because people show up.